This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, it's my pleasure to welcome today at the PhenoLab Professor Thomas Fuchs from the University of Heidelberg. Professor Thomas Fuchs, psychiatrist and philosopher, is the Karl Jaspers Professor of Philosophy and Psychiatry and head of the section Phenomenological Psychopathology and Psychotherapy at the Psychiatric Department at the University of Heidelberg. His main areas of expertise include phenomenological psychology, philosophy, and psychopathology. It further focuses on embodied and inactive cognitive science with a particular emphasis on interactive concept of social cognition. Among his recent publications, I would like to mention in 2018, The Ecology of the Brain, The Phenomenology and Biology of the Embodied Mind, published by Oxford University Press. In 2020, Randzonen der Erfahrung, Beiträge zu phänomenologischer Psychopathologie, published by Albert Verlag, if I'm not wrong. And in 2021, In Defense of the Human Being, Foundational Questions of an Embodied Anthropology, published by the Oxford University Press. Thomas, thank you for accepting our invitation. Today we present a talk entitled The Intercorporeality of Thoughts, and we are very much looking for your presentation. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to give this talk. I start right away. The sense of touch, let me see, somehow. Yeah, now it works. Okay. The sense of touch is the first sense with which we encounter the world. And it is the last to leave us when we approach the threshold of death. It belongs to the largest organ of our body, namely the skin, with which we have the most extended contact with the world. It constitutes the sphere of touch with its multiple sensual, social, communicative, and also erotic dimensions. And last year, even the Nobel Prize for Medicine has been awarded to 2 touch researchers. Nevertheless, touch has recently experienced an era of prohibition. With the corona pandemic, touch became so to speak, the ultimate taboo, and the imperative of social distancing prohibited handshakes and hugs, as well as touching care for the elderly or manual therapies of many kinds. The pandemic gave us an impression of what life would look like without touch, how much we missed spontaneous hugs, handshakes, or pats on the shoulder. But even before Corona, an inhibition, a caution, sometimes fear of touch had spread throughout society. One could have diagnosed a tendency towards a touchless society. Digital and media technologies have contributed significantly to this social distancing, because digital networks have become the most important source of social interaction, especially for young people. So the intercorporeality of touch is no longer taken for granted. It seems to have to justify itself today. Well, these introductory remarks lead me to the question of how touch actually mediates sociality. What exactly is it about touch that makes it the primary social sense, so that the much more general concept of contact also derives from it, namely from the Latin contingere, to touch. So we speak of email contacts, although they certainly no longer have anything to do with touching the other. Could it even be that without the sense of touch, we could not experience the other at all, that it is therefore constitutive for our sociality? Well, these are the questions I want to explore in what follows. And I will start with a general phenomenology of the sense of touch, and then turn to its social meaning. Now, if we look at the sense of touch in relation to the other senses, it is clear that it is the only one that mediates the experience of a boundary of ourselves. Hearing and smelling are, as it were, permeable to the world. Also in tasting, it is only the sense of touch of the tongue that creates a boundary to the food. The sense of sight does encounter boundary surfaces, including those of the body, but these body surfaces would not differ in principle from those of other seen objects if they did not coincide with the proprioceptive and tactile sensations of the lived body. In touch alone, we are really dealing with boundary surfaces, namely with the resistance they offer to our application of force and with their impenetrability. At the same time, we feel ourselves in every touch, namely as the body that we are, as at its outer boundary, the skin. The sense of touch is therefore essentially bipolar. In touching, we experience the foreign as well as ourselves. Let's consider the experience of feeling the bark of a tree. On one hand, I feel the sensation of my hand or my lived body. Erwin Strauss has called it the pathic moment of perception, the pathic sensing. Now, through these sensations of my palpating hand, I can at the same time feel the roughness and structure of the bark. So by shifting my attention slightly, I experience the sensations of my hand as the surface that I'm palpating. And in Strauss' terms, the pathic moment now becomes the gnostic moment, or the discerning moment of perception. So through my sensing, I perceive the surface of the tree. And as the example of a blind man and a blind person reading Braille shows, the touches of his fingers can even function as carriers of meaning. He or she can read with his fingers. So the sense of touch becomes transparent not only for the surfaces of things, but even for the semantics of symbols. It is the bipolarity of the sense of touch that enables the distinction between body and non-body, self and non-self. And thus also the primary experience of the body's boundaries. Because at its border, in the resistance of the surfaces of things, the lived body also shows itself as bounded and as resistant, impenetrable also on its part. So through touch, the body constitutes itself as a material thing, as an object body. And thus the sense of touch is also bipolar insofar as it forms the transition point between the subject and between the subjective body and the objective body, or between Leib and Körper. And in a special way, the double sensations, which were analyzed in detail by Husserl, convey this corporeality of the body. If we touch a part of our own body, for example, the left hand with the right, we feel in the same spatial localization the body from the inside. On the other hand, we palpate the body or the hand from the outside. We feel the left hand as being touched, subjectively affected or afflicted. But at the same time, by touching it with the other hand, we feel it as resistance, as an object. Foreign surfaces do not have this ambiguous quality. That which I touch and which does not itself react with sensation, that is distinct from me. The double sensations thus have a central function for the constitution of the own body. Through them, it shows itself at the same time from the inside and from the outside, as a sensing thing or as a subjective object. The outstanding function of the sense of touch for self-constitution is also evident in ontogenesis. Aristotle calls the sense of touch the most primal perception, without which a living being cannot exist. In fact, touch develops in embryogenesis as the earliest sense. The 8-week-old embryo already responds to stroking of his upper lip region, or the nostrils, by retracting the neck and body, at a stage when eyes and ears are not yet developed as sense organs. The embryo can also distinguish whether it is touching itself or the surrounding womb. And by means of self-touch, it forms a first body schema. After birth, the infant shows a sucking reflex and seeks the mother's breast when touched at the mouth. However, the sucking reflex does not occur when the baby is stimulated with its own finger at the mouth. And this also shows the distinction between self and non-self. In the further development, the infant gets to know its body better and better by distinguishing its own from other surfaces through double sensations. Now, another crucial constitutional achievement is added, which the sense of touch accomplishes. All tactile experiences have in common that they are connected with the experience of pressure and resistance, as I've already pointed out. But our experience of the reality of the physical world is also based on this resistance. This insight is found in various philosophers, such as Wilhelm Dilthey, Max Scheler, Karl Jaspers, or Hans Jonas. According to Dilthey, we experience reality in those moments in which a sensuous impulse encounters a resistance which we experience as an inhibition of our intention. Jaspers states, correspondingly, what is real is what resists us. Whatever may inhibit our bodily movements or prevent the immediate realization of our aims and wishes is a resistance. The achievement of a goal against resistance or defeat brings with it an experience of reality. And I quote more extensively from Hans Jonas, The Phenomenon of Life. Reality is primarily evidenced in resistance, which is an ingredient in touch experience. For physical contact is more than geometrical contiguity. It involves impact. Thus, touch is the sense in which the original encounter with the reality as reality takes place. And a bit further on, for this reason, touch is the true test of reality. I can dispel every suspicion of illusion by grasping the doubtful object and trying its reality in terms of the resistance it offers to my efforts to displace it. Differently expressed, external reality is disclosed in the same act and as one with the disclosure of my own reality, which occurs in self-action. In feeling my own reality by some sort of effort I feel the reality of the world. So experiencing reality arises through resistance, an inhibition of our effect through counter-effect, and the sense of touch is primarily involved in this experience. Only experiences of pressure and resistance allow us to feel things in their concrete materiality, to literally grasp their impenetrability. The sense of sight is notoriously unreliable, particularly at the mercy of illusions and illusory images, like the proverbial Fata Morgana. With seeing begins the doubt, one could say. If we want to be sure that we are dealing with reality, we need our body and all our senses. We have to go into the room, touch things, smell them, handle them, deal with them. Touch is connected with agency. We are much more active with the sense of touch than with the other senses. And only in touch do we literally enter into direct contact with the world. The sense of sight makes the world appear before us as a spectacle, at a distance, or as a counterpart. The subject-object separation is also rooted here. Tactile experience, on the other hand, Merleau-Ponty writes, adheres to the surface of the body. We cannot unfold it before us, and it never quite becomes an object. We can ascribe one last constitutive performance to the sense of touch. The counter effect of touching also throws us back on ourselves. Somewhat pointedly, one could say that the sense of touch excludes us from the whole of the world. Without touch, we would always remain one with it. At first glance, this seems to contradict what I said before. But in fact, every experience of a border, contact, and separation are dialogued. In every experience of a border, contact and separation are dialectically connected. The other senses open ways into the world, but the sense of touch implies the experience of separation. We touch and we are rejected. It is this reverse movement, feeling oneself at what is other, which indicates the existence of a world to the lived body and awakens self-consciousness in us. And this was already seen by Schiller. I quote, "It is the primarily ecstatically experienced resistance through which the drive impulse first becomes capable of being conscious. The becoming conscious and the ego relation linked with it is in all the manifold stages and degrees in which it takes place, always only the consequence of our experiencing the resistance of the world. Reflective consciousness develops in the experience of the border, just at the physicality of the body, which repels itself from the objects. And this repulsion presupposes an impulse of movement which originates from the still elementary urge of the lived body or its instinctive impulses." I go on with Schiller's account. Consciousness arises only in the primitive reflexio of sensation, and that always on occasion of appearing resistances. All consciousness is grounded in suffering, and all higher stages of consciousness in increasing suffering in relation to the primordial spontaneous movement. Thus, the reflexive consciousness is already laid out in the elementary reflection, which manifests itself in the resistance of things against our own movement. Now we have already followed the sense of touch in its elementary constitutive performances so far. On the one hand, it is self-constituting, namely through the experience of self-delimitation and self-touch. On the other hand, it is reality constituting, namely through the experiences of resistance and impenetrability. Indeed, it contributes essentially to our becoming conscious, because it repels us from impenetrable things and refers us back to ourselves in a reflexive way. Now, on this background, what about the sociality of the sense of touch? I've already indicated that it is rooted in the dialectic of the boundary, that the sense of touch establishes separation from the world, as well as original contact with the world. Touch is separation and connection at the same time, writes Novalis. The bipolarity of touch is thus also the precondition for its reciprocity in social contact. The touch of another human being means a bodily communication that says, this is me and this is you. It is precisely through experiencing ourselves as separate from one another that we sense one another. And this reciprocity is what makes touch special in comparison to the other senses. While we can see without being seen, listen without being heard, speak without receiving a response, we cannot touch the other without being touched at the same time. We can be in contact here virtually, online, sense of taste and the sense of vision, sense of hearing can be transmitted digitally, but touch can only occur when we are at the same time in the same space. The skin is therefore both a separating and a connecting boundary surface. And thus, in social contact, the skin serves not only as a sensory organ, but also as an organ of expression. Certain dynamic, rhythmic, tactile processes also represent expressive qualities. Whether we touch slow or quick, superficial or deeper, tender or rough, attentive or casual, all these forms of touch also express the emotional relationship to another person. We use touch every day to tell someone that we are anxious, sad, happy, in love, maybe even sexually aroused, and more. And it is interesting to note the range of tactile metaphors that are employed routinely to describe people. People can rub each other up the wrong way, and they can have prickly or abrasive personalities. We talk of getting in touch with people, of certain people being hard to deal and needing to be handled carefully, of people being touchy and thick-skinned or thin-skinned. People can get under one's skin or be only skin deep, and so on. But the sense of touch already constitutes sociality on an even more elementary level. It lets us experience that we are dealing with another embodied subjectivity. That means with our own kind, and thus establishes a primary familiarity with the body of the other. If we touch living things, they behave differently from inanimate objects because the living thing reacts, it stirs under our touch. To touch and grasp a human hand feels different than a robot hand, even if the latter moves mechanically. There's something springy, vibrant, resonant about the social touch of skin to skin. At the same time, touching another conveys the same unity of aliveness and thinghood that we have already experienced in our own bodies. Merleau-Ponty has pointed out that in the double sensations that I've already mentioned, touching the left hand with the right, the body of the other is also anticipated. I quote this passage here: by experiencing that my body is a feeling thing, that it is irritable, it and not only my consciousness, I am prepared to understand that there are other animalia and possibly other humans. If the existence of another is evident to me by squeezing his hand, it is because it takes the place of my left hand Because my body incorporates itself into that of the other, he and I are like the organs of a single intercorporeality. By the way, that's the passage where the term intercorporeality is first mentioned by Merleau-Ponty, so that is in the context of touch. The entanglement of interiority and exteriority with self-touching is thus transferred to the intercorporeality of touch. The other body, like my own, is also a kind of subjective object, which shows itself to me in its animatedness, a unity of bodily self-manifestation and objective body. And on this basis, the body of the other can also become for me the medium of his self-expression. In his body, his movements and gestures, I perceive at the same time his experience, his sensations, his feelings. Because the body of the other is like my own, not only a material object, but a manifestation of his life and experience. But the experience of reality that the sense of touch conveys also extends to the other. Only in touch does he become irrefutably present to me. To connect with each other haptically by shaking hands in greeting, to transcend one's own sphere for a moment, is an expression of an embodied and not only distanced or virtual encounter, in which we mutually assure each other of our presence. This is why the unbelieving Thomas in John's Gospel wanted to touch the risen Christ, even to put his finger in his wound. He wanted to be sure that he was not only dealing with a ghost, today we would perhaps say with a virtual reality, and for this he had to feel the body of Jesus. And not just any part of the body, but precisely his stigmata, which can be understood as an expression of the bodily history of Jesus. That means of his vulnerability as an earthly bodily being. A related tale is found in the Odyssey, when Ulysses returns to his palace in disguise and unrecognized. His old blind nurse, Eurycleia, is given the task of washing his feet, and while doing so, she feels on his thigh the scar of a wound inflicted on him as a child by a wild boar. And from this, she recognizes him. The sense of touch also has a history. It preserves the memory of a familiar person. One knows how the beloved partner feels, even without sensing him. Even without seeing him. It is no coincidence that the most religious rituals are also tied to the bodily presence and touch, such as baptism, marriage, the last rites, healing rituals of traditional cultures in many forms. It is the bodily presence that makes the ritual effective. And the touch of the priest or healer conveys the spiritual power that passes on to the believer. Finally, let's remember that the handshake is also used to seal an agreement with the power of a signature or contract. Mutual touch affirms the binding nature of what has been agreed upon. And we see in all these phenomena how the intercorporeality of touch is as capable of producing a shared reality as it is capable of producing a shared history. In the age of digitalization and virtualization, such intercorporeal rituals and bodily shared realities seem all too easily outdated to us. Nevertheless, all virtual or online communication always remains related to the possibility of real encounter with the other, to the intercorporeal presence that ultimately only touch can mediate. Other sensory modalities, as I've said, can be digitized. Only in online contact, in touch, one must be at the same place and at the same time when touching each other. Virtually, only the idea of being touched can be awakened, and there is no telepresence of touch itself. Mutual touch is the ultimate affirmation of shared reality, and it must be given at least as a possibility in bodily presence for us to become real for each other. If we now consider the role of touch for ontogenesis, we will see how the general phenomenology of touch is confirmed by the development of sociality in childhood. I've already said that the skin is the primary sensory organ of the child. Already in the womb, it senses the elastic resistance of the uterine wall as a counterpart, as the other or non-self, by which the embryo becomes aware of itself. After birth, this close tactile envelopment is initially lost. The infant needs all the more to be held and touched to feel the mother's closeness and warmth. The infant also immediately senses whether he or she is being touched gently, tenderly, firmly, or even roughly. That means he senses the affective or expressive quality of the touch. The skin thus becomes the first medium of the interpersonal relationship. The significance of skin contact with the mother lies in the fact that it allows the resistance and thus the reality of the mother to be experienced at the same time as her affection, warmth, and tenderness. Every basic baby care and baby care activity involves touch, such as breastfeeding, bathing, changing diapers, stroking, and cuddling. And this constant tactile communication is indispensable for the vital growth of the infant, as well as for its emotional development. A lack of warmth and skin contact in early childhood phase impairs neuronal differentiation, leads to growth retardation, and later to behavioral disorders. Already in the 1950s, René Spitz recognized the biological necessity of loving attention and touch to institutionalized infants and toddlers in homes, who after separation from their mothers were provided with sufficient food and good hygienic standards, but were only scarcely touched and held by the staff. And they fell into what Spitz called anaclitic depression, showed significant behavioral problems and even a high mortality rate. In the 1990s, there was a wave of research showing the consequences of deprivation of touch on human development. Children from Romanian orphanages who were hardly touched in the first years of life later showed considerable cognitive, emotional, and social deficits, as well as delays in brain development. Important insights into early touch research were also gained through the experiments of Harry Harlow with young rhesus monkeys in the 1960s. When given the choice between a milk-giving surrogate mother, replicated from wire and cloth-covered, and a cloth-covered surrogate mother without milk, the one is on the left side, the surrogate mother without milk but with a cloth covered is on the right side. So when given the choice between the two, the young monkeys were much more likely to satisfy their need for closeness and physical contact with a cuddly mother than to satisfy their hunger with the wire mother. And when confronted with frightening stimuli in another experiment, the young ones fled immediately to the cloth mother. If, on the other hand, they had grown up with only the wire mother, they cowered helplessly with frightening stimuli. They literally froze, or they screamed and cried. Harlow's experiments were certainly problematic from the point of view of animal ethics, but they proved the crucial importance of touching contact in a time of dominant behaviorism, and thus they at least gave a starting point for the further development of attachment theory in humans as well. Another significant result of touch research in the 1980s was the discovery of special tactile receptors in the skin, the so-called C-tactile afferents. They do not respond to rapid skin contact like the other receptors, but to slow contact. In the meantime, it has been shown that these receptors respond most to a striking speed of 1 to 10 centimeters per second, so a rather slow stroking, and to gentle pressure. And this, of course, corresponds to a tender touch, to stroking, caressing, tickling, or gentle massaging. The activation of these afferents is associated with a bodily feeling of warmth and well-being when touched. So these receptors transform the mechanical stimulation of the skin into a gentle, tender touch feeling. And this is known to have a calming, anxiety, and pain-relieving effect. This effect is mediated, among other things, by the release of the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin is released particularly intensively during breastfeeding, but also during close skin contact between mother or father and infant. It promotes social closeness, affection, love, and bonding to a particular degree. Also later, gentle touching and stroking has a less strong, but in principle similar effect. The hug is not only an expression of familiarity, affection, friendship, or love in almost all cultures. It also has a proven stress-reducing, blood pressure lowering, and antidepressant effect. The manifold application of touch in manual therapies, in massage, body therapies, osteopathy, Feldenkrais work, and many other approaches is based on the bodily felt and at the same time physiological change of mood that the touch of the skin by the other person is able to trigger. The ancient healing power of laying on of hands, of touching, fell into oblivion in modern times and had to be rediscovered. For example, around 1800, by the Viennese physician Franz Anton Mesmer, who achieved amazing healing successes through touch and concluded, of all the bodies in nature, the greatest effect on man is by man himself. He had no explanation for this effect, so he attributed it to what he called animal magnetism. That means an electrical irritability of living tissue, which had just then been discovered. Well, today we have better physiological explanations, but they do not change the fact that intercorporeal touch always has something magical to it. One of the most intense forms of contact is, of course, the erotic touch, which is able to set the entire body in arousal, to literally electrify it. The sense of touch is probably the most erotic of the senses. And this dimension of touch consists essentially in the fact that one's own body softens, opens up, and surrenders to the caressing hand of the other. It resonates, as it were, like a violin that is stroked by a bow. Of course, the eroticism of touch also requires the boundary. That means the difference between self and non-self, which, however, is not emphasized and not held as such, but rather dissolves in the movement of opening, resonance, and connection. In this context also belongs the fact that, which is well known, one cannot tickle oneself, because when doing so, the implicit anticipation of the effect of one's own movement on the skin does not allow the surprise effect to arise, which is necessary for tickling. One must also be able to surrender to the tickling, so to speak. Otherwise, the vibrating and laughter-driving sensation on the skin does not arise. The eroticism of touch is not only based on the special quality of touching or caressing, but also on its intimacy. The touch of the skin is probably the most significant marker in the subtle structures of closeness and distance that characterizes social disorder, and that characterizes social orders. It comes closest to the other's body. Therefore, outside of family relationships, a not just fleeting but slow and tender touch signifies the crossing of a boundary that gives rise to an erotic atmosphere. The kiss then represents the next stage, because the touching of the lips, and even more so of the tongue, largely eliminates the physical distance between two people. Phenomenologically, it is easy to see why the kiss has this quality. On the one hand, the lips are particularly sensitive to touch. On the other hand, they form the gateway, so to speak, to the interior of the body. The moisture and softness of the lips, as well as their proximity to the saliva, the first liquid of the body's interior, also softens the resistance that the skin otherwise offers. And thus, this kiss of the lips enhances the merging body boundaries, enhances the merging of body boundaries, and can also suggest sexual union, which is then anticipated in the French kiss as penetration into the body of the other. And thus the kiss of the lips can also suggest the sexual union, which is then anticipated in the tongue kiss as penetration into the body of the other. So the sense of touch marks the zones of encounter, of affection, and of transition to union and merging, as it belongs to the erotic sphere. On the other hand, touch, apart from the handshake, can also represent an illicit transgression of boundaries and intrusiveness, precisely because of its intimacy. Degrading and humiliating treatment, even more rape or torture, usually begins with a rough touching of the skin, followed by a violent taking of possession of the body. The disregard of the body boundaries is therefore marked by the inversion of the loving touch into raw grasping. We refer to the dignity of human beings as untouchable, but this doesn't change the fact that rough touching can be particularly degrading. The sense of touch as a sense of boundary and transition thus also always implies a social ambivalence, namely between loving proximity and communication on the one hand, and boundary transgression and intrusion on the other. And this ambivalent meaning of touch is also referred to by terms such as tact or tactfulness. In German, even more telling, we say Fingerspitzengefühl, so a sense of the fingertips, literally. And these are figurative terms for human interaction that knows how to handle the relationship between proximity and distance with care and with sensitivity. Such a sense of tact becomes particularly important when, in the care of the elderly, contact crosses boundaries that haven't been used to revealing to strangers since childhood. To conclude, the sense of touch has a multiple polarity that distinguishes it among all senses as a sense of boundary, contact, and transition. On the one hand, it is receptive, reacts to contact. On the other hand, it is active, it explores things through movement. On the one hand, it is self-constituting, namely through the experience of self-touch and agency. And on the other hand, it is reality constituting, namely through the experiences of resistance and impenetrability. At the same time, an elementary reflection is connected with this experience, contributing to the self-awareness of the bodily subject. And thus the sense of touch enables the subject to distinguish and differentiate itself from others and from strangers, to experience and reflect on itself, and to make contact and communicate. In these ambivalent experiences of the sense of touch, the characteristic relationship of a living being to its border is manifested. For by means of its border, it separates itself from its environment and defines itself. At the same time, however, through its border, it enters into exchange and contact with the environment. And in this respect, the phenomenological analysis confirms Aristotle's statement that the sense of touch is the most original of the senses in all living beings. Finally, the sense of touch is also constitutive for human sociality. The entanglement of subject body and object body in the double sensation returns in the touch of the other. I perceive his body as subjective, that means as animate and expressive, without having to make clear to myself through a theory of mind, through analogies or projections, that I'm possibly dealing with another subject. No other sense conveys the reality and actual presence of the other like the sense of touch. Touch expresses the social polarity between relatedness and demarcation, a polarity that can lead to experiences of intimate closeness, but also of intrusive border crossing. The most intimate form of erotic fusion is only possible through direct physical contact, but conversely, the most serious forms of humiliation, abuse, or violence are also experienced by the touched body. I said at the beginning, not least in the wake of the corona pandemic, seem to be moving more and more into a touchless society in which digital and media technologies are replacing our real embodied encounters. But a society in which we are no longer touched by each other and thus no longer affected in the bodily and in the emotional sense, such a society we cannot endure in the long run. The virtual presence of the other is what it is, an illusion that ultimately only the tactile experience can dissolve. So no one is really looking at us from a smartphone, and we cannot touch the other on a touch screen. The virtual presence of the other cannot replace the intercorporeality of touch. Thank you for your attention.